Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Zana Investments monthly webinar. I'm your host, founder, and CEO of Zana Investments, Tim Little. We help people diversify away from the volatility of the stock market and get competitive returns by providing them the opportunity to passively invest in multifamily real estate. As some general housekeeping rules, I just ask you please mute yourselves when not speaking. If at any point you do have a question, you can go ahead and drop it in the chat and we'll address it during the Q&A portion. During the Q&A portion, you can also raise your hand and I'll call on you. And just so everyone knows, this is being recorded and I'll send it out as soon as it's available. Finally, I encourage everyone to put in their contact information in the chat so that we all can continue to build our network. All right, with that out of the way, I'm excited to get into the presentation. Tonight, we have with us Dave Foster. Dave is a 1031 exchange expert and qualified intermediary. Not only that, but he has over 20 years experience working in all phases of real estate himself. As an investor, he understands real estate investors and how they can best leverage the 1031 exchange to grow their portfolio. He even helped me early in my investing career when I did a 1031 exchange of my duplex into a triplex. Dave, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Please tell the guests a little bit more about yourself and then kick off the presentation whenever you're ready to go.
Thank you, Tim. It's great to be here. By the way, I don't know if I ever gave you this tip or not, but since we live in the same region and you're fresher here than I am, during these days when it feels like winter, since you probably don't have gloves anymore, a pair of socks work. And that's what we've been using anytime the temperature hits 50, because that's how chill our blood is these days. But it is great to be here where it's still somewhat warm. It's great to be talking 1031s with you. So I think you said it all. I'm just a serial real estate junkie that found a way to use the government's dollars for my benefit about 25 years ago, using the tools of the 1031 exchange and the Section 121 primary residence exemption. And with those two tools, we've crafted basically an entire investing career consisting primarily of those two, and have never paid a penny in capital gains tax since the very first one. But that was a mistake, and I didn't know the process yet. So that's why I love coming to talk to groups like this, because it is such an awesome tool that's out there. I thought perhaps if you're okay with this, I've got a short deck that we can go through, and it's not going to take very long, but it'll hit the high points as well as some of the more advanced types of things that we're seeing 1031s used for these days. And then we can have a nice, healthy Q&A time if you'd like.
Yeah, absolutely.
That sound good? So I am going to try to share screen. Like I told you before, if it doesn't work, it's usually my fault. Oh, look at that. It's going to make me a liar. So the question is, why is that? There we go.
Yep.
So the 1031 exchange, you want to understand this as an opportunity to sell business or investment real estate and indefinitely defer the payment of the tax that normally you would have to pay by purchasing new investment real estate. Now, let me give you one other little piece of bonus material. The Section 121 primary residence exclusion. A lot of people know about it, but so many people still don't, or don't know the full impact of it, that I always like to touch on it, because there is actually a couple ways that Section 1031 can interact with Section 121 to actually turn tax deferred into tax free. The Section 121 primary residence exemption simply says that when I sell a piece of property that I purchased and moved into and lived in for at least two out of the 5 years prior to selling it, then as a single individual, I get to take the first $250,000 of profit tax-free. And if you're married, that doubles to $500,000. The key is that you can do this once every 2 years. So once every 2 years, you have the opportunity to buy a piece of property, move into it, live in it for 2 years, sell it, and take up to $500,000 in profit, tax-free. There's almost no other gift that the IRS gives you that's any better. Now, What are the qualifiers? It's got to be your primary residence, which does mean you're going to have to move. And sometimes that's tough with a growing family like you've got, Tim. Sometimes it's tough to get people out of the house. But we also all go through a very natural progression where the first house we live in becomes small when the first child comes along. And then we got to get something bigger. And then we want to move to the suburbs. And then we want this. And then we want that. And then the reverse starts to happen. And we start to downsize. Through all of that, from the statistics that NAR gives us, you will have 8 to 10 opportunities in your life to take tax-free money from the sale of your primary residence. Now, one of the things that I had promised you was some advanced techniques to be able to diversify your portfolio and go from active management into passive syndication investing. Right here's opportunity number one. Because when you sell your primary residence and all of that money is tax free, don't use all of the proceeds to go buy your next property. Instead, use enough proceeds as a down payment, but then take the bulk of your now tax free and use that to go invest where you will. You're not restricted to investing in anything. So you could invest in the stock market, the racehorses, Las Vegas. You could go on an Alaska cruise, or you could invest in real estate syndications, and boom, in one fell swoop, you sold a house that was too small. You bought your next house that you want. You got tax-free dollars to do it with, and you got another chunk of tax-free dollars to go invest with. Now you're on your way. You see how those things start to interplay and work together? Okay, the keys to this are it's your primary residence, it's tax-free, it's every 2 years, and you don't have to be living in it when you sell it. You only have to have lived in it for 2 out of the 5 years prior to sale. Okay. Now, let's move to where the meat is 1031. With 1031, you're talking about business or investment real estate. That's different. Secondly, it's not tax free. When you sell, you're going to purchase new replacement investment real estate. And by doing so, you will get to indefinitely defer paying the tax on the profit. So it's investment real estate. It's only tax deferred, and it does have to be used for investment when you sell it in order to qualify for the 1031. So those are the two parts of the code. Now, it's easy to see why I would want to take advantage of the tax-free aspect of 121, right? It's tax-free. But why would an investor use 1031 exchanges? There's an argument out there that I'm going to have to pay the tax anyways. Why not just pay it and go on? Start with a very basic example that's going to encompass only 4 transactions. These 2 investors are going to start with the exact same gain. They're going to buy the exact same properties using the exact same percentage down payments, have the exact same appreciation, everything. The one difference is that the first investor, this is investor A, is going to do a 1031 exchange. So when they sell, they're not going to pay tax on that transaction. So look at what we've got there in column 4. The tax they pay, 0. Now that tax is only deferred. It does not disappear. Where does it go? Look at column 7. So investor A does a 1031. They don't pay the tax. They still owe $20,000, but they still have all 100,000 of their proceeds that they can use to buy their next property. And a 20% down payment, that lets them buy a $500,000 piece of property. Makes sense. Now, the only difference for investor B, they're going to pay the tax as they go. So they're not going to owe any tax in the column. They get to sleep at night. They're good little taxpayers. They're making sure that our roads are being built, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But because they have to pay that $20,000 in tax, they only have 80,000 left to go and purchase their new property. So they can only purchase a property worth 400,000. There's a $100,000 difference already. Now, that doesn't seem like much, but let's fast forward to the very next transaction. They're going to hang on to these properties for 5 years at the same rate of appreciation. Investor B's property is worth, or Investor A's property is worth 638,000. Investor B's property, because they started out with less, is only worth 510,000. So a lot more gain for Investor A, isn't there? Again, they're not going to pay tax, but that tax doesn't go away. It's only deferred into that last column. So they now owe almost $50,000 in tax, but they're not worried about it because that leaves them with 238,000 as a 20% down payment on a $1.1 million replacement. Investor B did just fine. Once again, they're paying the tax as they go, so they don't owe any tax, but they only have 138,000, 168,000 to use to go buy their next property, so they can buy less. Let's go forward 10 years. And this is where we really start to see it diverge for the two investors. Now, there's no extra transactions during this time. We're literally only talking 4 transactions. But investor A, when they sell that property, again defers the tax and is now able to buy almost $3 million in real estate. Investor B only has 354,000, so they can buy a property for 1.7, almost $1 million less than what investor A can afford. Now, the argument is, but wait, investor A owes a lot of money. Yes, that's correct. But on that extra $1 million at a 10% rate of return on your cash flow, how much is investor A making just in cash flow? Not in appreciation, not in anything else, just in cash flow. $100,000 a year. So they can simply spend a year of banking cash flow and they would be able to pay almost their entire tax bill when they wanted to. And when they did that, guess what? They would still own $3 million of real estate. Whereas investor B doesn't owe any tax, but they're making a lot less money and they own a lot less property. You want to see something that'll make your eyes bug out? Look at year 20. Oh my goodness. Now, 20 years is a good long investing career. And investor B's not done bad for themselves. They don't owe any tax. They own 4.5 million in real estate. Life is good. But because investor A allowed or took the opportunity to keep the government's money and use that $472 to buy more real estate, they own $12 million of real estate. And if they chose to, it's only going to take them 6 months of cash flow to pay that $472,000 if they want. And they still own 12 million at the end of that. And investor B still owns 4.5. Tim, I know you. I know which one you'd rather be. Me too. I'm an investor A guy all the way. Now, the argument against this, of course, is this is only deferred and it doesn't last forever. You're going to have to pay the tax sooner or later. And I've got 2 responses to that. And we're going to get to them. Response number 1, just in general, though, is that's not true. And I'll tell you how that works in a little bit. But if I tell you now, you'll leave the call. We'll have to kill you, search it out, and everything. So, no, you don't have to ever pay that tax, and I'll show you how. But number 2 answer is it doesn't matter Because if you don't want to go 20 years, but you only go 10 years and then pay the tax, investor A was still better off, weren't they? Investor A was better off after 5 years. That's because any day that you get to use the government's dollars for your benefit is a day where you make more money. And it's really just an exercise in compound interest, isn't it? I get to make the money off of the deferred tax, and then I get to make money off the money that I made off the deferred tax, etc., etc., etc. So, do I have anybody salivating yet? 1031 exchanges, I think, are such a valuable tool if you can make them work within your business model. Now, there's 6 requirements that all have to be met, and we could spend an entire night just fleshing these 6 out. But instead of doing that, I'd rather get to the fun stuff, which is how we use them. So these we're just going to glaze over real quickly. Yeah, as we said before, 1031 exchanges are only for real estate that you intend to hold for investment, not your primary residence, not fix and flip properties, because your intent in fix and flip properties is not to hold, it's to sell. And your intent must be to hold. Most people feel comfortable anything more than a year, but there truly is no statutory hold period. It's all about what your intent is. There's 2 timing requirements. They both start with the date of the closing of your sale. The 1031 exchange starts with the day you sell the property. It ends with the day you buy the property. You've got 45 days simply to identify your potential replacements. They don't have to be under contract. They simply have to be identified. But at the end of day 45, that list is set in stone and cannot be changed. Now, you can close on your replacement property during the 45-day period. That's perfectly fine. You can be under contract for your new property even before your old property sells. A lot of people will use that to hedge their risks in a seller's market. They go find their new property, get it under contract, then sell their old property, and then purchase the new property. And that can be a great way of easing the angst of that 45 days. But your choice is either purchase it during the 45-day period or turn in a list. And after day 45, that's the list you get to work with. From the day you close the sale, you have 180 days to complete the purchase. Now, that doesn't seem so bad. Yeah, that's right. The 45 days is really the angsty number. But you do want to keep track of 180 days, especially if you're dealing with like new construction. We have a lot of people that to try and get away from capital expense that's looming. So you've been investing in older properties that are about to need roofs, siding, extensive remodels, whatever. Rather than do that and have to incur that expense, why don't you sell it 1031 into new construction where now you don't have to worry for 5 or 10 years about that capital expense stuff. It's a great way to maximize profit. The key is you have to take title. So the builder's got to have that red property done for you before day 180 after your sale. So the hack for this, go into contract for the purchase of that property 6 or 8 months before it's going to be done. Or I'm sorry, before you sell your old property. Close your old property 8 months later when you know that the builder's going to have your property done within 2 or 3 or 4 months. That makes sense? It's a great hack that people don't think of. But capital expense has been the killer of many a good deal. Now, you have to use the services of a qualified intermediary. That's someone like me. The only rule we have is we perform the 1031 exchange. The key is you have to have one in place before you close your sale. If you close your sale, come to me then. I can't do it because it has to be documented on the settlement statement of the sale, and you cannot touch the money. So, no option. You've got to use a QI. The QI has to be in place prior to the closing of the sale. Tim, how many questions did I have to answer as your QI as we were going through the process?
It was my first time, so it was probably a lot.
Exactly. As a matter of fact, I think we went through at least 2 cups of coffee at that Starbucks that one day.
Yep.
It's very normal that so many questions will rise, primarily because the IRS has to let you do 1031s, but they don't have to be to make it easy. So they don't. So the QI has to document, they have to hold the proceeds, and they're like your guide through the mines of Moria. They're the ones that are taking you through that maze. So you want them in place sooner rather than later because planning is always going to be the key to a successful portfolio. Title requirements really simply means that either whoever is on deed to the old property has to be on deed of the new property, or whoever's tax return reports the activity of the old property has to report the activity of the new property. Any tax-paying entity can do a 1031 exchange. If it's an LLC, that LLC is going to do the exchange. If it's an individual, that individual is going to do the exchange. But you have to match up either the title or the tax return or both to make it valid. Lastly, the reinvestment requirements typically will confuse people the most. And within here, though, is the greatest opportunity. In order to defer all tax, you must purchase at least as much as your net sale. And secondly, you must use all of the proceeds from your sale in the purchase or purchases. Notice I said purchase or purchases. The 1031 doesn't have to be one for one. We'll talk more about that in just a second. So let's say you sold a property for $320,000. There was $20,000 of closing costs and commissions. And so that leaves your net sale, $300,000, and there was a $100,000 mortgage. So you have $200,000 of proceeds. Actually, I'm going to change this up a little bit. Let's say you sold for $530,000, $30,000 more closing costs and commissions. So your net sale is $500,000. There was $200,000 of mortgage. So your responsibility to defer all tax. Purchase at least $500,000 using all $300,000 of cash. Now, you can purchase less than you sell. You can take cash out. When you do that, the IRS says you're taking profit. Now, you may have put $20,000 down to buy it. If you take $20,000 out, you don't get to call it the return of your down payment. The IRS makes you call it profit first. So if you take money out, you're going to pay tax on it. That's the way it goes. But here's the great opportunity. You can do that and you still get to defer whatever tax is in there. Or you can complete your 1031 exchange and after the fact, do a cash out refinance. Pull the money out then because that's not a taxable event. Now, this is where it could get really fun. Because again, following Napoleon Hill's example of creating multiple streams of income, my rental portfolio is one. My syndication portfolio is another. How can I get money without paying tax from my rental portfolio into syndications? 1031, refinance, take the cash, invest the cash in syndications. Now, remind me again, when I do a cash out refinance, who's paying that mortgage? It's the tenant, isn't it? So it's not costing me anything more other than some opportunity cost on cash flow, but that free cash, I converted into an investment in a much more lucrative investment. And at the same time, I started to hedge risk by creating two streams instead of concentrated in one. Does that sound like a winner?
Absolutely.
Could I possibly make it better?
Let's see. I challenge you to do so.
I'm like the Romco salesman. But wait, there's more. There's this little thing I like to call defensive investing, where you take that $300,000 and instead of buying one new property for 500, use it to buy two properties. Take 250,000 and go buy a property for 250,000 free and clear. Now, how much do I have to buy? I have to buy 500 to defer all tax. But my first property is going to be 250. And that 250 has no debt on it. So I've sheltered it from risk basically. As I go along, all I've got to do is rent it for enough to keep the lights on. So if something bad happens to the rental market, if something bad happens to me, that property's safe. I'm going to take the other $50,000 of cash and use that as a down payment to go purchase a new property worth $250,000. So, did I, in my 1031 exchange, did I sell for 500 and buy for 500? Yep. Did I use all 300,000 to do that? Yep. So, that transaction completely tax free. I now own a property that's free and clear, out of harm's way. I also own a property that's highly leveraged. So if there's some arbitrage that I can get from interest, boom, that's there. So I'm getting the best of both worlds. And I don't know if a lot of you folks are not liking the interest environment. You're scared of the interest environment. Everybody's got a different take on it. I'll just tell you this. I bought my first property at 15% interest. So, A, that tells you I'm really old. And B, that tells you that 7% ain't crap. As long as the numbers work, we're still in a pretty advantageous position. But all that being said, if you feel like this is a high interest environment and you don't want to take on more, guess what? Just leave that first property alone. It's not costing you any money. It's pure cash flow. And since you're actually netting greater NOI, you could use that to pay down the mortgage on that second property more quickly, which then gives you the opportunity to refinance it more quickly. And if interest rates come back down to where you like them, or if you find a property you really want, or if you find a syndication you want, then you simply refinance the debt free property. And in one fell swoop, you now have two rentals and a third investment in something else. I absolutely love this tool because the strategic cash out advance is so good and it leaves you still able to use all the deferred tax to invest. So, reviewing the basics, it's got to be investment property. Your primary residence, different animal. 45 days to identify, 180 days to close. Got to use a qualified intermediary. The title holder has to be the same, or the taxpayer has to be the same between the sale and purchase. And if you want to defer all tax, you've got to purchase equal or up. So there's the basics with a couple nice little tips and tricks along the way. How do most people use these? You could use them to consolidate because just like I said, you don't have to sell one and buy one. You could sell two and use the proceeds to buy one. Why do I do that? If I'm wanting to move into larger assets, like you were talking about, Tim, it was time to start grabbing bigger assets. So you sold your smaller rentals, combining them in 1031 exchanges to go purchase a larger property. You got $400,000 properties, go sell them, 1031 exchange them to buy one $400,000 property. You cut your workload, you cut your management, you cut your risk. You possibly, if it's a multifamily property, are generating more money than you were before. All those are good things. Consolidate. You could also do the opposite, what we talked about earlier. Sell one and buy two. Why would I do that? The defensive investing we talked about. But also, if I bought a property for 200,000 and I fixed it up, put a renter in it, rented it, it's now going to sell for 400,000. I can do a 1031 exchange and buy a $400,000 property. But what if that doesn't make me comfortable? What if I understand what it takes to make a $200,000 property nice, like countertops, flooring, etc., but I don't know what it takes to make a $400,000 property nice? Or what if, which is more common, a $200,000 property rents for $1,500, but a $400,000 property rents for $2,500? Why wouldn't I want to sell the $400,000 property and not get $2,500 a month in rent, and instead buy two $200,000 properties where I'm getting $1,500 a month each in rent? So I'm diversifying, buying more, getting greater rental dollars per door. This is the greatest single most used strategy for the beginning investor because you're able to use the proceeds as down payments on multiple replacement properties. You can also plan these for your retirement. If you get a hankering to, you're in Ohio right now where it's cold and you know where your snow shovel is, but you want to retire down by us where we don't have snow shovels. You could start to sell your portfolio now and use the 1031 exchange to buy properties in Tampa Bay or Sarasota or wherever you want to retire, so that when you're ready to retire, your rental portfolio is waiting for you. You sell your property in Ohio. Remember, that's tax free. You move down to Florida, buy another property or whatever, and you've got your rental portfolio right at your hand. Pretty sweet, huh? But wait, there's more. There's also this process called a conversion. Remember, I said the requirement to get the primary residence exemption is that you don't have to be living in it when you sell it. You only have to have lived in it for 2 out of the 5 years prior to selling it. To do a 1031 exchange, it has to be 1031 when you sell it, and you're selling investment. You have to buy investment, but you don't have to keep it as investment forever. So if you bought a really nice vacation rental in Siesta Key, and now it's time to retire, you could sell your Cincinnati property that you live in, and that money's tax free. Where are you going to move? Go move into that Siesta Key property and convert it into your primary residence. Conversion doesn't create a taxable event, but it does start the clock ticking on a new period for you to get at least part of that property tax-free. How does that work? When you convert a property into your primary residence, after you've done a 1031, once you have owned it for 5 years, once you have lived in it for 2 out of the 5 years prior to selling it, then you get to take a proration of the gain tax-free. In other words, do a 1031 exchange, buy Siesta Key, use it for a rental for 2 years. After 2 years, sell your primary residence, take the money tax-free, move into Siesta Key, live in it for 3 years, then sell it. And when you sell it, did you own it for 5 years? Yeah, you rented it for 2, lived in it for 3. Did you live in it for at least 2 out of the 5 years prior to selling it? Yeah, you lived in it for 3 years. So you get 3/5 or 60% of the gain tax-free. So remember the argument that all those people made? Dave, they're going to have to pay the tax anyways. No, you're not. You will be able to prorate it. What if you lived in that for 8 years through your retirement? You'll get 80% of all the deferred profit tax-free. And you'll only have to recapture the depreciation and pay tax on 20%. That's a heck of a retirement plan. I've got a realtor down on St. Pete Beach, Tim, that's got 3 identical condos on beachfront. They're all on the same floor. His retirement plan, he moved into the first one. As soon as he's got enough money tax-free, he'll sell it, pay a little bit of tax, take the rest tax-free. Now, I ask you, where's he going to move?
To the other one.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And the clock starts again. His entire retirement centers around living in really nice places and letting the clock turn tax deferred into tax free. So, to those people that say you're going to have to pay it anyways, I just smile and say, no, you're not. Here's the last way. Actually, it's going to be, we're going to talk about estate planning because I don't have a slide in here, but there's a 4 D's of 1031 investing. The first D is deferred. And this goes way back to what we said at the very beginning. If you're going to sell a property with a lot of profit and you're still going to invest in real estate, do the 1031 exchange and defer the tax. Because every day that the tax money is in your pocket, you get to make the money off of it. The second D is defer. Because you can use the 1031 exchange throughout your career to go from any type of real estate into any other type, to go from any location into any other location, to go from high appreciation to high cash flow, to go from high management to low management, active to passive, to go, I said, from any other type, to do anything you want, as long as you're doing the 1031 exchanges. You will continue to defer the tax. Oh, the last one was to go from areas where prices have escalated quickly to go find the next hidden gem. You know how many? I wish I had a nickel for every San Francisco Bay Area investor that I worked with in 2014 and 2015 who said, it's too high here, but I really like what Tesla's doing in Austin. And now they call Austin kind of like the 4th suburb of San Francisco Bay. And everybody that 1031 did that, get out like bandits. Buying in Gothenburg and Sevierville after the wildfires and selling in Denver was a huge win. Those are the kinds of opportunities. And as long as you're doing the 1031 exchange, you get to keep using the tax for your benefit. Hey, Tim, what do you think the third D is?
I'm going to guess defer.
Yes, because why? I can use it to move to my ultimate retirement destination. I could use it to convert real estate into my primary residence so that it ends up becoming tax free. And because when I die, my heirs receive my property at what is called a step up in valuation. So they get it as if they paid market value for it on the day I die. Now, it's not fun to think about, but we're all headed that way. Oh, you know what? I just messed up. That was the fourth D. I forgot to introduce that. And you never would have guessed it. I would have challenged you. But the fourth D is die. So defer, die. We don't want to think about it, but we're all going there. And that step up in basis, my estate doesn't pay the tax. My heirs don't pay the tax. That nobody pays the tax. It goes away. And my children are left with a lifelong legacy of real estate that's tax free and debt free, and they get to start over and do it again. And this is why there's only two groups throughout history that have always ruled the world. Always. The banks and the landowners. Whether it's in the feudal system, whether it's the old Catholic Church, whether it's McDonald's, the banks and the landowners rule the world. And I want my children to be there. And the 1031, that's why I think it's perfect.
No, Dave, that was awesome. It was a great overview on all the different aspects. I think it's just hard to comprehend how many different ways you can use it when all you've been exposed to is the very basic way. The first two steps, essentially, which is what I did. And I was happy with what I got out of it. But there was certainly that angst in the 45 days, and 180 days wasn't so bad. But like you said, I think with everything that you talked about, it really comes down to having a plan and having intentionality. If you look at the long game on this and don't just view it as oh, I can do this right now and get this done. But if you're planning this over a period of 2 years, 5 years, 20 years, then it can really start to be a game changer.
Yeah, and I think that's probably why you hear my focus be more on strategy. Because really in my world as a QI, we make money doing 1031 exchanges for people. But the way that I was introduced to them 20 plus years ago was as an investor. And I saw it as a way for me to transition our life into a life of tax-free living. And we personally use the 1031 exchange and the 121 exactly as I just described, including conversions, to move our portfolio from Denver, Colorado to Stamford, Connecticut to Fort Myers, Florida, and end up moving onto a sailboat that I purchased with tax-free dollars and spent 10 years raising my children on a sailboat, making a living off of my 1031 clients and income from my vacation rental portfolio, which had been positioned using 1031 exchanges. So just by nature, I tend to think more strategically. But the thing that I love is that if you're an adrenaline junkie, because I am, I get it. We got to sometimes just feed the beast. There's ways to do that using the refinances. But then instead of buying that property, fixing it, selling it, buy it, fix it, and then rent it. And by doing that, you then make it able to be used as a 1031 exchange later on. And if you want more money right away, so you can do your next project, do a refinance. That's what is commonly called the BRRRR method. Buy, rehab it, rent it, refinance it. And then I had an R, which is rest a little bit, and another R, which is reevaluate and see if it's time then to do a 1031 exchange. I've got a couple different clients that are doing 20 to 30 exchanges a year because that's exactly the model that they've used. And now they just have a ton of properties. And every one of these properties, they started out as a quote fix and flip, but then they kept them. And every property they're selling into 1031s, they've owned for more than a year and they're never paying tax. So whether you're an adrenaline junkie or you're slow and patient, it all works.
Yeah. And I think for us who are in the multifamily space, I think one of the most attractive things, at least from my perspective, is the scalability. We're always looking at the efficiencies that can be gained by scaling up. And even at the lowest level than I did it, going from a duplex to a triplex, I saw that scale even from the cash flow perspective, right? You add one extra door, as long as you're getting that same amount of cash flow, $200 per door with 3 doors is better than $200 per door with 2 doors. Now, if you just extrapolate that out over a period of multiple exchanges and you keep going, and then now you get into the commercial multifamily, the 5 units and up, then you're talking some big numbers, some big efficiencies, some big gains in terms of management and reduction of costs. All kinds of things that people don't think about if they've only really dealt with the single single family rental properties.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, let's take a second and let's revisit that whole multifamily syndication model because I hinted at it, but I didn't exactly express what the issue is. It's very difficult to 1031 exchange into a syndication because the taxpayer has to be the same. I have to sell investment real estate and I have to buy investment real estate. And most times, what I'm buying in a syndication is not real estate. What I'm buying is a membership interest in an entity that owns real estate. And that doesn't qualify for 1031, which is why I go back and say the whole key to being able to do it is the refinance. Since you can't 1031 directly into a syndication, do it by refinancing a property and use that money to invest where you don't have that handicap. But there's an animal that we're starting to see in the wild right now. And that is, strangely enough, the 1031 syndicator. So they're taking their time to find their next project. They're not in such a hurry that they just want to sell their old one, pay off their investors, and go buy the new one. They've realized that they've got a growing entity. They have a bunch of investors that believe in them. They like the long term nature of it. So we've got syndicators that are actually 1031ing the syndication because the syndication is set up as a limited partnership or as an LC. And in both cases, LCs and syndications can do 1031 exchanges, just not the individual members. So as a syndicator says, we've got a new project lined up. We're selling this property. We're going to do a 1031 exchange. And we'd like to invite all of our investors to go along with us. Your money will stay in the investment, but it will be tax deferred. And we're going to go buy this new one, and we're going to do exactly what we did the first time. Now, what a great way to reward your investors. What a great way to keep the relationship going rather than always having to look for new investors, right? And if one of those investors says, okay, I really don't want a 1031, I want my money out, it's as simple as buying that one investor out because the IRS doesn't care who the members of the LC or LPR. They only care that it is that LP that's selling and buying. So I think we're going to see a lot more opportunities for these kinds of syndications to go full cycle and then to be 1031 into new property. And we're going to see a whole new generation of tax deferred investors who are doing it passively inside syndications.
Yeah, and that's not something that I've seen yet. It's unusual, I would imagine, just because again, the aspect of having all passive investors to agree with it. We're talking fairly long timelines here, in most cases, 5 to 7 years. But if you can make it work, I definitely see the advantages. So, Dave, I want to open it up to the group to see if anyone else has any questions before I start hogging the limelight. Are there any questions from any of the attendees?
I got a quick question, Tim. I've heard about reverse 1031 exchanges. I have a sense of what they are. I'm just not sure the long-term strategy for those. I guess it's only, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's really when you want to make sure that you are able to, you have a property, you want to lock it in and you're not ready to sell the other property. What's the strategy, I guess, behind a reverse 1031?
Yeah, you're right. In a seller's market, what's the hardest thing to do? Find your new property or sell your old one? It's find the new one. So, and when we find that new property, so many times the sellers were unwilling to give us contingencies, et cetera, et cetera. So we would have to simply go into contract. And sometimes you end up with your dates crossed where you have to take title to your new property before your old property is closed. And that's when the reverse exchange comes into play. Because by statute, the 1031 exchange has to be a sale of investment real estate followed by a purchase. You can't take title to your new property. So, what the heck's a reverse then? In a reverse exchange, the qualified intermediary forms a holding entity. And that holding entity takes title to the new property. So you don't own it, but you're under control of that property. So that then you can go and sell your old property and then take title to the new property by taking it from the entity that's been holding it for you. Does that make sense? Just as a concept?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It makes sense. It sounds like it's just a way to get around the order of things, but the intermediary part, I guess, is the important thing because it's an entity that holds it and it's not you. But so that's, I guess that's an interesting way, but I
That's
get it.
exactly right.
And it's a seller. You got to be in a seller's market because I think, what is it? You have 180 days to sell your
Your old
property.
property. That's exactly right. Here's a couple other times when it works, though. There's really three applications. The first one is in a seller's market, or if you're just stuck having to take title to your new property, but your old property hasn't closed yet. Reverse works perfect. And you got 180 days to make it happen. But the second time is, and this one's huge, is let's say you're selling your old property for 500,000, and what you really want to buy is a small multifamily for 300,000 that needs $200,000 of improvements. Now, you can't exchange into improvements on property you own. So you could buy that property and that would eat up 300,000 of your exchange, but that's it. But if you did what is called a reverse improvement exchange, then we would take title to that new property using $300,000, and then you would improve the property using the other 200,000. And at the end of all of that, did you buy a property for 500,000? Yeah. The purchase was 300, the improvements were 200. You took title to it, spending all 500. Did you sell first and then buy? Yep. But what did you buy? You just got yourself a brand new building, all tax deferred. That's where improvement exchanges can really work well for you. But it's got to be improvements that you can get done during that 180 days. That's the bugaboo.
Thank you.
Awesome. Any more questions before we start to close this out? All right, Dave, I'm going to ask one clarifying question because I think it's something that people are going to want to understand. We talk about the like kind exchange. Now, when we say that, can you clarify in terms of does that have to be a single family or small multifamily to small multifamily or single family? That commercial multifamily to commercial multifamily, office building to office building? Does it have to be the same in terms of the asset type? Is that what we're talking about there?
Yeah, no, actually, not at all. The Irish uses two phrases: like kind and qualified use. Like kind simply means that it is real estate. And anybody who's been to real estate school knows that there's four types of real estate: there's commercial, residential, industrial, and raw land. Like kind simply means that it's real estate. It can be any kind.
Mm.
So you could sell multifamily, buy raw land, sell commercial, buy residential. Doesn't matter a bit. Qualified use means that it is being held for productive investment use. So the 1031 like kind exchange is investment real estate of any.
Okay. No, I appreciate that because I think there's some misconceptions out there, or maybe it's just me, but I think everyone could appreciate a little clarity on that point. So thank you for that. Dave, we're running up against the clock here, but this has been an amazing presentation. I think besides giving us the details and the requirements behind the 1031 exchange, what you've really done is broadened our minds as to the possibilities within a 1031 exchange. And that's the important part because so many of us just get that cursory top level view of what it is. But you've really laid out how if you use this as like a lifelong strategy, that it could be huge, not just for yourself, but for multiple generations.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah. Thanks, Dave. Hey, and for the next months, we do not have a guest lined up yet, but definitely keep a lookout on my social media and in your inbox for February's monthly live webinar. Thank you again, everyone, and have a good night.